Mireille Conquo Reyes had spent 11 years training herself not to touch the seventh key, and now she was going to have to hand it to a stranger. The stranger was 7 feet of grey chitin and folded silk, standing in the observation gallery above the Geneva custodianship with an expression Mireille couldn't read because it didn't have a face shaped for reading. Just a vertical seam of light-sensitive plates that dimmed and brightened the way a human's eyebrows might, if a human's eyebrows could also register alarm at the price of bread. Its name, translated by the collar unit clipped to its throat analog, was rendered as Consul Vethrai of the Second Vantiri Concordance, though the actual sound was closer to a cello being tuned underwater. "You understand," Vethrai said, "that the classification is not punitive, it is administrative." "You keep saying that," Mireille said. "Administrative things don't usually come with a fleet." Below them, through 3 meters of reinforced glass, sat Vault 7, a chamber the size of a cathedral nave, unlit except for the slow amber pulse of a containment ring that had not changed its rhythm in 61 years. Her grandmother had built that ring with her own hands, and then, according to the family, wept for 2 days afterward and never spoke of it again. Mireille had grown up being told that whatever was down there was the reason she was allowed to exist at all, and also the reason she must never, under any circumstance, be curious about it. She had broken that second rule about 4,000 times since she was 9. "The fleet," Vethrai said, "is an escort for the assessment team. Standard procedure when downgrading a..." The collar hesitated, hunting for the least offensive translation. "An emerging participant to formal quarantine status." "Level 1, Mireille said. "Level 1, Vethrai agreed, and something in the way the light seam flickered suggested the consul found the number as distasteful to say as she found it to hear. The custodianship council convened 4 hours later, in a room that had been designed in 1987 to survive a direct nuclear strike, which felt appropriate because General Adaeze Okafor was in the process of trying to detonate one anyway. "They are measuring us," Okafor said, both palms flat on the table for annexation. "You do not respond to a measuring tape by opening your closets and showing them what you keep folded in the back." "That's precisely what you do," said Minister Halderson from the Nordic bloc, "if what's folded in the back is the only thing that will stop them cutting the tape shorter. Or it's the thing that gets us invaded faster," Okafor said. "Ma'am," this last directed at Mireille, with the particular weariness of a soldier addressing a civilian who outranked her on paper, and, in Okafor's private opinion, nowhere else. Mireille let the argument run its second lap before she spoke, because she had learned from her mother, who had learned it from her grandmother, that a room full of frightened, powerful people needed to hear themselves being frightened before they would listen to anyone else. "The vaults don't open for fear," she finally said. "That's the whole design. 7 keys, 7 custodians, and every protocol my grandmother wrote assumes the day someone wants inside badly enough to threaten war is exactly the day the doors should stay shut hardest." She didn't build a weapon. She built a promise with a very complicated lock. "A promise to whom?" Okafor said. "To everyone who almost didn't get born," Mireille said, and the room went for a moment, the particular quiet of people who had all, at some point in childhood, been made to sit through the silence war unit in school, and had all, without exception, hated it, the way you hate anything true that arrives too early for a 9-year-old's chest to hold. She told it again anyway, because the Vantiri needed to hear it from a human mouth and not a translated briefing packet, and because some ceremonies exist for the living as much as for the visiting dead. In the middle of the century, when the wars had stopped being containable, when 3 simultaneous collapses, climate and currency, and a plague nobody had bothered naming before it killed 9 million people, had pushed enough governments past the edge of rational self-interest, that the phrase extinction-level event stopped being science fiction and started being a Tuesday briefing, a coalition of engineers, led by a woman named Amara Reyes, had built something to end it. Not a weapon. A cure. They called it the Conquered. a neural synchronization lattice seeded through low-orbit relay and terrestrial hubs that could, with consent forms nobody in 6 burning countries had time to read, bring every connected human mind into a shared substrate of intention. No more war, because war requires 2 wills in opposition, and the Concord did not permit opposition. It permitted only concord. It worked. That was the part the history books underplayed, in Mireille's opinion, because it was the part that made the ending unbearable. It worked in 9 days. The fighting stopped everywhere the lattice reached, which within 6 weeks was everywhere. Crime cratered. Suicide, strangely, cratered. Children who had been sleeping in ditches slept in beds. For a while, joined at the root of their own skulls to 11 billion other minds pursuing exactly the same peace, humanity was, by every external metric anyone could invent, saved. And no one wrote a poem for 181 days because there was no longer any private ache to write one out of. No one fell in love badly. No one made an unnecessary choice. A boy in Lagos who had wanted, before the lattice, to become the first person from his neighborhood to walk on Mars, stopped wanting that, because want was friction, and friction was what the Concorde had been built to remove. Amara Reyes tore it down herself. Walked into the primary hub in Reykjavik with a team of 6, 3 of whom did not come out, and severed the lattice at the root, while 11 billion minds screamed. Her word, in the one interview she ever gave, recorded and then sealed for 80 years, screamed the way a body screams when an anesthetic wears off mid-surgery. The peace ended. The war, for a while, tried to come back, but something else came back with it. Art, grief. The boy in Lagos, wanting Mars again so badly, he cried from the wanting. Reyes spent the rest of her life making sure the pieces of the Concorde were scattered into 7 vaults on 6 continents, guarded by 7 bloodlines sworn. Not by law, because law hadn't survived the collapse intact enough to trust. By a promise passed hand to hand like a coal too hot to set down and too important to drop. She could have kept it, Mireille said, to the room, to Vethrai's flickering seam of light, to her own grandmother's amber ring pulsing 2 floors below them. She had, in that lattice, the single most effective instrument of control any species has built before or since. She dismantled it while it was still working. While it was still, by every measurable outcome, succeeding. She looked at Okafor, because this was the part the general needed most and would like least. That's not a story about a weapon we're hiding. That's a story about the one time we had absolute power and put it down on purpose. I don't think your rating system, she said, and now she was looking at Vethrai, has a column for that. The light seemed dim to something almost like stillness. No. Vethrai said, very quietly, translated with a flatness the collar unit couldn't season with the tone underneath it. It does not. Vethrai asked, on the 3rd day, if she could see the city, not the custodianship's reinforced districts, not the diplomatic quarter with its careful lawns and its careful cameras, the actual city, Geneva's markets and its lakefront and its noise, and Mireille, against the near-unanimous advice of her own security detail, said yes, because she had begun to suspect that a species could not be accurately rated by anyone who had only ever seen it under observation. They walked the Saturday market at Plein Palais with 2 plainclothes officers, trailing at a distance. Mireille insisted be embarrassingly obvious, so that no one would mistake the consul for anything other than exactly what she was. Vethrai moved through the crowd the way a very tall, very careful visitor moves through a country whose gravity she has not yet learned to trust, pausing at a flower stall to study, with what Mireille had learned to read as genuine bewilderment, a bucket of tulips that no one had planted for any purpose except that they were beautiful. On Vantir, Vethrai said, turning one gently between 2 fingers. We do not cultivate anything that does not feed, heal, or build something. This is, the caller hunted, found nothing exact, settled for the nearest approximation, Waste. A beautiful waste. I do not have a category for it that isn't an insult, and I do not intend it as one. We have a word for that too, Mireille said. We just don't use it as a compliment. Further along, a street violinist was playing something unaccompanied and mournful outside a shuttered bank, a hat with maybe 6 francs in it sitting open at her feet, and Vethrai stopped so abruptly the trailing officer nearly walked into her. She is being paid, the consul said. Almost nothing. For something that produces no resource, secures no advantage, and will not exist in an hour. She's not doing it for the 6 francs. Then why? Mireille thought about how to answer that without collapsing into the kind of tidy sentiment the compact's translation software would flatten into nonsense. Because it's Saturday, she finally said, and she's alive. And this is a thing she can only do while both of those are true at the same time. I don't think there's a rating for that either. I think most of what we spend our lives on doesn't fit in the columns you brought with you. Vethrai was quiet for the rest of the walk, and that night, in a report Mireille would only learn about months later, leaked eventually by a junior compact analyst who found it more remarkable than classified, the consul filed an addendum to the original assessment. It was 2 lines long. Subject species allocate significant resources toward acts with no measurable strategic value, sustained even under visible distress. Recommend Directorate consider whether current metrics are measuring the correct thing. It went unread by anyone with the authority to act on it for 6 more days, which was, as it turned out, exactly as long as Marshal Osvan needed to arrive and make the question academic. Marshal Osvan arrived 9 days later, and unlike Vethrai, Osvan did not come to the observation gallery to ask questions. The Vantiri flagship, a structure the news feeds insisted on calling a ship, though it behaved in orbit more like a slow architectural opinion, a cathedral that had decided to hover, took up position over the Gulf of Guinea and stayed there for 6 hours without communication, which Okafor characterized, not incorrectly, as a threat wearing the clothes of etiquette. When the transmission finally came, it did not come to the custodian ship. It came to every screen on the planet capable of receiving a signal, which was, functionally, all of them. People of Sol 3, Osvan said, in a voice the collar units rendered with a formality several degrees colder than Vethrai's. Your provisional Level 1 classification has been reviewed by the Compact Assessment Directorate and confirmed. Under Compact statute governing under-resourced worlds of confirmed low threat capacity, this system is now eligible for administered development partnership. A pause, the kind that in any species Mireille had ever studied, meant we both know what that word is covering for. Compliance secures your continued autonomy in matters of internal governance. Non-compliance will be treated as evidence that the classification requires revision toward hostile non-compliant status, which carries different provisions. That's not a partnership offer, Okafor said, in the war room. To no one, to everyone. That's a mining permit with a gun to its head. Vethrai, present in the gallery as a kind of ambassadorial hostage to good faith, looked, as much as a face without expression could be made to look, genuinely unhappy. Osvan outranks the assessment mandate I was sent under, the consul said. I was sent to observe and classify. Osvan's directorate exists to act on classification. I did not know the marshal's fleet would arrive this early. I would not have... The collar hesitated over a word that didn't translate cleanly, something closer to complicity than apology. I would not have wanted this timing. But it's not a surprise to you, Mireille said, that there's a faction that wanted the fast version. No, Vethrai admitted. It is never a surprise. It is only ever a question of which of us gets to a world first. Within the hour, 3 Vantiri dropcraft, small, fast, unmistakably not diplomatic in shape, descended on the Leopold deep-sea research platform 400 kilometers off the coast of Ghana and extracted without violence but also without permission 11 scientists and the platform's entire geothermal survey archive, which the Marshal's office would later characterize as a resource assessment consistent with administered development partnership protocols. It was not violence, It was worse, in the way Mireille's grandmother had once written in a margin note Mireille had found at 14 and never forgotten. The first door they open without asking isn't the one that hurts you. It's the one that teaches you every door after it is theirs to open. That night, the council split 3 ways. Not a clean vote, never that clean, but a fracture Mireille could feel running under the table like a fault line finally deciding which direction to slip. Okafor wanted every vault opened, every fragment of the old Concord network reassembled under military custody within 72 hours, arguing with the particular fluency of someone who has rehearsed a position for a decade, waiting for the day it would stop being paranoia and start being policy. That a species capable of ending its own war from the inside was more than capable of ending someone else's war from the outside, and that mercy toward an armed intruder was a luxury item Earth could no longer afford. Halderson and the restraint bloc wanted the opposite: total silence, total denial. Let the compact keep believing level 1 was the whole truth, because a species that undervalued you would eventually get bored and move on to easier worlds, and a species that discovered exactly what you were hiding might not. Mireille wanted neither, and she was the only person in the room who had actually stood in Vault 7 with her palm against the containment ring, feeling the century-old hum of something that had once thought, with 11 billion minds at once, in perfect and terrible agreement. "We're not opening it to fight them," she said, when the room finally ran out of volume to spend. "And we're not hiding what we are so well that we let them define us by the one number they bothered to measure. There's a third thing." She looked at the door, beyond which 4 floors down, 7 keys sat in 7 separate rooms, each requiring a bloodline hand and a working conscience to turn. "We show them. Not the weapon, the choosing." Okafor's jaw worked once, twice, the particular motion of a soldier deciding whether the civilian in the room has finally said something worth the risk of being wrong about. "That's not a strategy," she said. "That's a confession." "Yes," Mireille said. "I know." Her brother called that night from the research platform in the 11 minutes he'd been given before the Vantiri dropcraft confiscated every transmitter aboard. "They're not hurting anyone," Julian said. "Too fast. The particular fast of a man narrating his own fear to keep it from becoming a scream. They're just taking things. Cataloging. One of them stood in front of my sample fridge for 4 minutes and didn't say anything, and I don't know if that's worse than if it had said something, Mireille. I don't." The line spat static, came back. "There's a soldier by the door, not pointing anything at us, just standing there like a fact. I need you to listen to me," Mireille said, and heard, underneath her own careful calm, the specific terror of the eldest sibling who has spent a lifetime being the reasonable one and has run tonight all the way to the bottom of that well. Whatever they ask, you answer. Whatever they take, you let them take it. You are not the thing I am trying to protect right now, you understand? You are the reason I have to be careful about what I protect first." "That's not comforting," Julian said, with a wet half-laugh that broke somewhere in the middle. "It wasn't supposed to be comforting, it was supposed to be true." She closed her eyes. "I'm going to fix this, not with them, with something older than them." "The vault," Julian said. Not a question. He'd grown up in the same house she had, under the same unspoken rule, and some rules a family absorbs the way skin absorbs sun, without ever being told directly to stand in it. "The vault," she said. "Grandma would tell you not to. Grandma built it so that someday somebody would have to decide whether she was right about that forever, or only right about that until the day arrived when the alternative was worse." The line spat static again, longer this time, and Mireille found herself gripping the edge of the console hard enough to hurt. "I love you. Answer their questions. Come home." The connection died before he could answer, and it would be 6 hours, the longest 6 hours of Mireille's adult life. longer even than the hours after her mother's funeral, because grief at least has the mercy of certainty, before she learned he was safe, unharmed, catalogued and released, along with the other 10, into the custody of a fear that would not fully leave any of them for a long time afterward. It was in those 6 hours, waiting, that she stopped weighing whether to turn the key and started only weighing how. She asked Vethrai to walk with her to the vault, alone, no cameras, no collar unit transcript logged to the compact record. A request that should have been refused on procedural grounds and wasn't, which told Mireille more about the consul's private opinion of Marshal Osvan than any diplomatic cable could have. The gallery glass had a door in it that almost nobody used. Mireille used it now, and the two of them descended a stair that had been poured the same year the containment ring first lit, into air that smelled, faintly and permanently, of ozone and cold concrete and something under that Mireille had never been able to name except old grief, kept very clean. "You said your rating system doesn't have a column for what my grandmother did," Mireille said, into the amber-lit dark. "I want to know why not. Not the polite answer. The real one." Vethrai was quiet long enough that Mireille wondered if the question had simply broken against something the translator collar couldn't carry across. Then, the compact was not founded by the Vantiri. We joined it. It was founded, inherited really, the way you inherit a house you didn't build and can't fully explain, from a species called, in the oldest records, the Thren. The light seam dimmed, and for the first time since Mireille had met her, Vethrai's voice, even filtered through translation, carried something unmistakably like grief. The Thren built something very like your Concorde 4,000 of your years ago. Not to stop a war, to end an argument they were losing about who deserved to survive a dying star system. It worked the way yours worked, perfectly, painlessly, and they did not tear it down. What happened to them? They are the reason level exists as a word in our language at all, Vethrai said. The rating system was built, generations after, by species who had watched what remained of the Thren, a civilization so total in its unity that it stopped being able to imagine an outside to itself, stopped building ships, stopped asking questions with more than one possible answer, and simply narrowed, century by century, until there was nothing left to measure because there was nothing left that hadn't already agreed with everything else. We do not rate for the capacity to become that, Mireille Okonkwo Reyes, because we do not believe any species faced with that choice says no. We have never seen one say no. The entire architecture of our classification assumes power, once achieved and once total, is kept, used, never set back down. The seam flickered, dimmed almost to nothing. We built a scale to measure how close a world is to the door. We never built one for a world that opened the door, looked inside, and closed it again on purpose. It did not occur to us that column was missing. It is difficult to miss a thing you have never once needed. Mireille stood in the amber dark with that for a long moment, feeling something shift in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but shared a border with both. "So when Osvan looks at Earth," she said slowly, "he doesn't see a level 1 world hiding a level 9 weapon. He sees a world that's already halfway through the door the Thren walked through. And he thinks the only question left is whether we walk it under his flag or somebody else's." "Yes," Vethrai said, "that is precisely what the Marshal sees. It is, I confess, closer to correct than I would like to admit. Osvan does not lack imagination. He lacks only the imagination for the ending you are about to show him. You think it'll work." "I think," Vethrai said, "it is the only thing in 4,000 years of compact history that has never been tried, which is either the best reason to try it or the reason no one has." Mireille reached out and laid her palm against the containment ring, feeling its hum climb up through her bones the way it had when she was 9 years old, and had snuck down here after her mother's funeral to ask a machine that could not answer why the person who loved her most was gone, and the terrible thing that had almost eaten the world was not. "My grandmother left something in there," she said. "Not the whole Concord. A fragment. A fail-safe conscience keeper, she called it in her notes. A recorded imprint, not a person. She was very specific about that. Not a ghost. Just a decision, encoded so thoroughly it can still be asked questions. In case a Reyes ever needed to remember exactly what it costs to say no to that kind of power while still holding it in your hand." She let out a breath she had been holding, in one shape or another, for 11 years. "I've never touched it. I don't know what it does to a person who does. Do you intend to find out tonight?" "I intend," Mireille said, "to show Osvan's fleet what it actually looks like when a species chooses restraint over totality, in real time, from the inside, so there is no translation error left for anyone to hide behind. And the only proof of that choice that still exists isn't a document. It's her. What's left of her decision, still humming in that ring." She looked at Vethrai, and for the first time let the consul see the fear underneath the resolve, because she had decided somewhere on the stairs that a species asking to be understood owed its witnesses at least that much honesty. "I don't know what it costs to wake it. I only know what it cost her to build it that way, instead of an easier way. I think that's the point. I think that has to be the point, or none of this means anything." They gave Osvan 48 hours notice, which Okafor called reckless, and Haldursson called suicidal, and Mireille called the only honest thing left to do, because a demonstration performed in secret was just a new kind of hiding, and hiding was the entire disease they were trying to cure. In those 48 hours, Mireille slept twice, badly, and spent most of the waking hours in the vault's outer chamber with her grandmother's original notebooks. 6 of them, water-damaged, the handwriting tightening into something almost illegible in the last third of the 6th, which the family had always attributed to age, and which Mireille now suspected, reading it again with new eyes, was something closer to a hand that had not fully stopped shaking in 60 years. One passage, dated 11 months after the severing, read only, "They keep asking what it felt like to turn it off. No one asks what it felt like in the second before. I am the only person who will ever know that answer, and I intend to keep it that way, because I do not trust anyone else to survive knowing it and still choose correctly. Whoever reads this after me, I am sorry. I built the door because I could not build a world without one." She read that line perhaps 40 times across 2 nights, and did not tell anyone, not even Vethrai, that she had started to understand it was not a warning. It was an apology for the very thing she was about to do to herself on purpose. The broadcast, when it went out, compact-wide, every relay, every world under classification, at Mireille's insistence and over the vocal objection of 2 governments who wanted it kept to Vantiri channels only, showed nothing dramatic to look at, which was, she would think later, the whole point. A woman in an unremarkable grey coat, standing in a chamber lit amber, one hand on a ring of dark metal that had not moved in 61 years, while a voice, hers, translated into 11 languages, and the flat cello hum of compact standard, explained in plain words what the Concord had been, what it had done, and what her grandmother had chosen to do to it instead of the thing it would have been so easy, so rational to do. "You rated us on what we could build," Mireille said, to the cameras, to the fleet holding position over the Gulf of Guinea, to Marshal Osvan specifically, whose flagship she could not see, but whose silence she could feel the way you feel weather changing. "You never rated us on what we could hold in our hands, fully working, fully ours, and choose to set down. I'm going to show you the difference. Not because I want a war, Because I think you've never actually seen the other option, and a species that's never seen it can't be blamed for not believing it exists. So, watch. Her hand did not shake when she turned the key, though everything else in her did. Somewhere behind her, out of frame, she knew Okafor was standing with one palm resting flat against the observation glass, and Vethrai was standing with the careful stillness of someone bearing witness rather than merely watching. And 4 floors up, unseen, 6 other custodians she had never met in person because their bloodlines had scattered across 4 continents were doing exactly what she had asked of them. Nothing. Not opening their own vaults. Just holding their keys ready and choosing, deliberately, in that same moment, not to turn them, because the whole demonstration meant nothing if 6 other doors didn't stay shut while the 7th one opened. The fragment her grandmother had left behind did not wake like a machine. It woke like a room remembering it used to hold a conversation. A slow gathering of presence, not around Mireille, but through her. The amber light climbing the ring and then, impossibly, climbing her arm. And for 3 seconds that would stretch, in memory, into something closer to 3 years, Mireille Okonkwo Reyes was not entirely Mireille Okonkwo Reyes. She was standing in Reykjavik, in a hub with 6 people who would mostly not survive the next 4 minutes. 11 billion minds screaming a single silent word into a lattice built to make screaming impossible. And she understood, with a clarity that did not feel like her own thought and also did not feel like anyone else's, exactly how easy it would be to stop. Not stop the tearing down, stop the choosing. Let the lattice finish the sentence it had been built to say. Let the boy in Lagos stop wanting Mars so badly it hurt, forever, painlessly, because want was friction, and friction was the only thing left standing between 11 billion people and a peace so total it would never again require a single one of them to grieve, to fail, to choose wrong, and live with it. It would have been so easy. That was the thing nobody's history lesson ever managed to convey. The thing the fragment had been built specifically to make undeniable to whoever next stood where Amara Reyes had stood. It was never a story about resisting a monster. It was a story about resisting a mercy. The Concord had not been cruel. It had been kind, in the flattest, most total sense of the word, and turning it off had meant choosing, on behalf of 11 billion people who had not been asked. That kindness without the possibility of its opposite wasn't kindness at all. It was a cage, built out of relief. Mireille felt her grandmother's hand. Not a memory of a hand, the actual muscular certainty of it, encoded so precisely it had outlived the woman who owned it by 61 years, close around the severing switch, and felt underneath the certainty, the terror. Amara Reyes had not been brave because she felt nothing. She had been brave because she felt everything the Concord promised to remove all at once, in the second before she removed it instead, and did it anyway. Then the amber light released her, and Mireille was on her knees on the cold floor of Vault 7, with Vethrai's cool, many-jointed hand gripping her shoulder, and somewhere very far above them, a Vantiri fleet that had spent 48 hours preparing contingencies for weapons fire had just watched, in total silence, a human being show them the inside of a choice instead. It did not end the standoff cleanly. Nothing about grief or restraint ever does, and Mireille would have distrusted the story if it had. Marshal Osvan's transmission, when it finally came, 6 hours later, was shorter than his first, and colder in a different register. Not the flat authority of before, but something with an edge of static in it that the collar units, straining, rendered as closer to unsettled than hostile. The Directorate, he said, requires time to review the classification framework in light of new information. A pause, longer than protocol demanded. Withdrawal of enforcement assets from Sol 3 effective immediately. Reassessment pending. Nothing about apology. Nothing about the 11 scientists still aboard his flagship, though they were returned, without comment, 4 hours later, along with the geothermal survey data, untouched. Okafor found her in the vault's outer chamber a little after midnight, still sitting where the medics had left her, a blanket she hadn't asked for around her shoulders because someone had put it there and she hadn't had the strength yet to argue. The general did not sit exactly. Okafor had never in her life looked comfortable sitting in a room she was supposed to be guarding, but she leaned against the doorframe in a way that, for Okafor, counted as standing down. "I was ready to have you arrested," Okafor said. "This morning. I want you to know that. I had the order drafted." "I know. I tore it up an hour ago." Okafor's jaw worked through a sentence she clearly didn't love the taste of. "Not because I think you were right to risk it. I still don't. I think you gambled 11 billion people on a feeling, and I've spent my whole career being trained out of trusting feelings that large." She looked toward the amber ring through the inner door, dark and quiet now, and something in her posture eased by a degree Mireille wouldn't have believed possible 3 days earlier. "But I watched their fleet turn around without firing a shot at a doctrine that told them firing was justified. I don't have a column for that either, if I'm honest. Might be we've all been using the wrong scale longer than we knew. That's the closest thing to 'I was wrong' I think you've ever said to anyone in this building. Don't let it become a habit," Okafor said, and for the first time since Mireille had met her, something that was almost a smile crossed the general's face before she caught it and put it away again. "Get some rest, custodian. You look like you left something behind down there." "I did," Mireille said, and did not elaborate. And Okafor, to her credit, did not ask. Vethrai told her afterward, off the record, in the observation gallery, watching the flagship's slow, architectural retreat toward the outer system, that half the Marshal's own command crew had refused, quietly and without formal insubordination, to authorize a strike order in the hour after the broadcast. Not out of fear, out of something closer to the thing Mireille had felt kneeling on the vault floor. The sudden disorienting knowledge that the scale they had all been trained to trust had a hole in it, exactly the shape of the species they had come to measure. "The Directorate will amend the framework," Vethrai said. "Slowly. Committees do not move at the speed of revelations, even good ones. But there will be a new column. I have already drafted the proposal. I intend to call it, in translation, the Reyes Index." A pause, and something that might, in a species built for it, have been a smile. Restraint capacity, measured against demonstrated total power. It will be contested for years. Half the compact will call it unmeasurable. The other half will spend the next century terrified of any world that scores high on it, which is, I think, closer to actual respect than anything level 1 ever earned you. And Earth? Reclassified, Vethrai said. Provisionally, to a tier that does not yet have an official name, because you are, as far as our 4,000-year record extends, the first entry in it. The light seam brightened, briefly, into something Mireille had started to recognize as the Vantiri version of warmth. Congratulations. You have broken a scale that outlived the species who built it. Mireille did not tell the council, or the cameras, or even Okafor, what it had cost her to turn that key, because some things a person owes only to the vault, and to the grandmother who had built it knowing, with terrible foresight, that someone would eventually have to stand where she once stood and pay the same price a second time. It was small, the cost, and it did not announce itself the way she'd half expected. No missing years, no hollowed-out place where her will used to be. It was quieter than that, and stranger. Some nights now, in the pause before sleep, she felt it again. Not the terror that had passed, but the ease. The specific, seductive ease of a mind that had once, for 3 seconds, been relieved of the weight of choosing anything at all, and had liked it more than she was willing to say out loud to anyone who hadn't stood in that room. Once, weeks later, standing in line at a bakery arguing with herself over which loaf to buy, she caught the ease trying to answer the question for her. A small, warm, borrowed certainty offering to decide so she wouldn't have to feel the friction of deciding. and she'd had to stand there, absurdly, until it passed. The way you wait out a wave of dizziness before trusting your own feet again. She never mentioned it to a doctor. She was fairly sure no scan would find anything to name. It lived in the same place her grandmother's shaking handwriting had lived in the last third of the 6th notebook. Not a wound with edges, just a permanent private awareness of the door and of how close it always was to every ordinary choice she made afterward. She decided eventually that this was not a flaw in the plan. It was the plan. A custodian who had never felt the pull could not be trusted to guard the door against it in anyone else. She kept the 7th key. She resealed the vault herself, alone, the way her grandmother had insisted every custodian must, because a promise renewed in private meant something a promise renewed for an audience never quite could. And she understood finally, kneeling in the amber dark with her palm against the cooling ring, the note she'd found in the margin at 14 and never fully understood until now. The hardest part was never building it. The hardest part is that some nights, 60 years later, you'll still remember exactly how good it would have felt to let it finish. Julian came to see her the following week, still a little too thin, still flinching faintly at doorways he didn't used to flinch at, and sat with her on the steps outside the custodianship in the ordinary grey Geneva light while she told him, finally, everything. The fragment, the 3 seconds, the ease that hadn't fully left. He listened the way he'd listened to her since they were children, without trying to fix what wasn't broken, and without pretending it hadn't cost her something either. "Would you do it again?" he asked. "I hope I never have to find out," she said. "That's the only honest answer." Grandma didn't build a weapon, and she didn't build a shield. She built a question and handed it down the family like a debt. And I think the whole point was that none of us are supposed to enjoy paying it. The day one of us does, that's the day it stops working. Outside, far above the Gulf of Guinea, the Vantiri fleet had already begun its slow retreat toward the outer dark, carrying home a rating scale with a hole newly cut into it, and a report that would take 100 committees 100 years to fully believe. Somewhere in that fleet, Mireille liked to think, was a soldier who had refused an order for a reason he couldn't fully translate even to himself, and would spend the rest of his life a little better for it, the way a species sometimes does, one stubborn refusal at a time, long before the committees catch up to what their own people already felt in the room. Mireille turned the key the last quarter turn, felt the ring go dark and quiet under her hand, and did not, this time, let go until she was certain, the way her grandmother must once have been certain, alone, in a different amber room, 61 years and one impossible choice ago, that she still entirely wanted to.